In a lot of ways, the 1700s don't represent humanity at its best. The 1700s was the era of the American and French Revolution and global European colonial conquest. Towards the end of the 1700s, after losing the American colonies in the Revolutionary War, the English king, George III, took possession of the southern continent, at that time known to Europe as New Holland, despite the presence of the indigenous cultures already living there. These cultures, of course, were already practicing dance and ceremony here as they had done for thousands of years. During the decades following colonization, much of these ancient traditions, along with their communities, would be displaced and many lost in the border wars of the European expansion into the country. The English colonization of Australia begins in 1788 when the first fleet makes landfall in the Gweagal territory that the English will call Botany Bay. Here the English will set up a prison colony for the transportation and punishment of petty and political criminals. This is an unforgivably brief summation of the causes and effects of the English colonization of Australia. It would be terrific if there was some actual educational content about it on YouTube. A year later, in 1789, the first theatre performance in the European tradition is presented in the colony. Several of the convicts, with or without the assistance of the officers, depending on who you believe, got up a production of George Farquhar's The Recruiting Officer. Farquhar was a fairly underwhelming dramatist who was surprisingly often restaged, probably because of the amount of sex he used to put in his plays. The convict production, staged as a celebration of the King's birthday, was attended by 60 people, including the governor of the colony, and they didn't do too badly. According to Lieutenant Captain Watkin Tench, the colony's first real diarist, that every opportunity of escape from the dreariness and dejection of our situation should be eagerly embraced will not be wondered at. The exhilarating effect of a splendid theatre is well known, and I am not ashamed to confess that the proper distribution of 3 or 4 yards of stained paper and a dozen farthing candles stuck around the mud walls of a convict hut failed not to diffuse general complacency on the countenances of 60 persons of various descriptions who were assembled to applaud the representation. Some of the actors acquitted themselves with great spirit and received the praises of the audience. A prologue and an epilogue written by one of the performers were also spoken on the occasion which, although not worth inserting here, contained some tolerable allusions to the situation of the parties and the novelty of a stage representation in New South Wales. Despite the speed with which European theatre was imported to Australia, the establishment of any kind of ongoing theatrical venture was not very favourably thought of by the colony's administration, its officers and priests. The military were of the opinion that light entertainments constituted a luxury not to be afforded to convicts, and the colony's only clergyman, the Reverend Richard Johnson, had moral concerns, writing home in November in 1778 that the people of the new colony prefer their lust before their souls, yea, most of them will sell their souls for a glass of grog, so blind, so foolish, so hardened are they. No church is yet begun of, and I am afraid scarcely thought of. Other things seem to be of greater notice and concern, and most would rather see a tavern, a playhouse, a brothel, anything sooner than a place for public worship. These attitudes would still hold sway decades later as the first professional theatres were being established, and a strong argument could be made that they still affect us today. However, despite the official reticence towards a theatre, the growing colony was not without its Shakespeares and melodramas. The first evidence of anything like an ongoing attempt at a theatre company is found in Norfolk Island, and ends with the Norfolk Island Theatre Riot. The Norfolk Island colony was set up to be a prison for those recidivists caught still transgressing after transportation. Due to its relative isolation from the mainland, the interim Lieutenant Governor of the island, Major Ross, attempted to reduce the drain on government resources by allowing convicts to farm land and do other work to support themselves. This quickly resulted in the prison island becoming more akin to a farming community. Not long after their settlement, but long enough for Ross to have been replaced by Lieutenant Governor Philip Gidley King, the convicts of Norfolk Island made application to the new administration for permission to rehearse and present a play. King was of the opinion that this might help keep relations between the convicts and officers cordial, and so agreed. In the meantime, however, those relations were already fraying. There's some evidence to say that the Norfolk Island Theatre was set up in a disused granary. Those given responsibility for overseeing the project were the colony's surgeon, William Balmain, who lent the project an element of respectability and promised authority, and one of the island's constables, Thomas Crowder, who was in most practical respects the manager and director of the company. Crowder's company was made up of a mix of convicts and the military, and it's not recorded what plays they chose, but there is evidence to suggest that there had at least been one other production before the night of the riot. On the night of the 18th of January, tensions amongst the population were already high. The deteriorating relationship between the convicts and the officers had already almost tipped over into violence before the performance commenced. Crowder, sitting in seats at the front to keep them reserved for the governor, was assaulted and manhandled from the seats by soldiers determined to take them for themselves. The play went on relatively unhindered, and it was only as the audience began to leave the theatre that tempers flared again and the riot that had been threatening finally erupted. Though the riot was quelled, the tensions continued to grow and King was forced to put a militia together to maintain the peace in the following days. Though witnesses reported that much of the discord was initiated by the officers, Thomas Crowder, along with William Doran, an actor in the play, were accused of inciting the crowd to riot during the fight. They were transported back to Port Jackson on the mainland for trial, and Lieutenant Governor King was forced to order the closure of the theatre. Records from that era are spotty at best, and it's reasonable to imagine that convicts and local settlers of the day found ways to perform for each other that have not been preserved. For instance, in 1796, there is evidence that former convict Robert Sidaway had established a theatre in Bell Row, now Bligh Street in Sydney. Sidaway's theatre is described as comprised of some of the more decent class of prisoners, male and female. The playhouse cost £100 to build and was perilously lit by fat lamps and rushlights made from the rushes of Rushcutters Bay. Sidaway's function on sufferance, the authorities warned the proprietor that the slightest impropriety would be noticed and a repetition punished by banishment of the company to the other settlements. That sufferance would not last long. Sidaway's playhouse struggled on into the 1800s, leaving a scattering of notices and associated complaints in the press, until all evidence of them disappears around 1807. The few playbills that survive show that Sidaway's had a company of several regulars, almost all of them convict or ex-convict, and that they presented, amongst other things, Henry IV, Romeo and Juliet, and She Stoops to Conquer. Between 1807 and 1830, theatre was at varied fortunes in the colonies. Applications for the licensing of a permanent professional theatre company were largely denied for reasons of morality and discipline. But colonial bureaucracy was far from uniform in the fledgling colony, and so it was that convict theatre flourished for a brief period at the Emu Plains settlement in the 1820s. The growing civilian population of Sydney had been agitating for professional theatre for some time, and Governor Bligh had promised to build a playhouse in 1807. These plans were cut short by the Rum Rebellion, however, and there was also a very vocal element in the colony firmly aligned against the establishment of a theatre. The Reverend William Cowper was outspoken in his objection and waged a campaign in the press against the pro-theatre faction, who were equally vocal in the press. For instance, in the Sydney Gazette of July 21st, 1825, an unnamed correspondent writes in support of the need for a permanent professional metropolitan theatre. It must be rather mortifying, I should think, to the lovers of the drama in this metropolis, where is to be found the concentration of our colonial respectability and gaiety, that in this species of fashionable entertainment, the amateurs of Emu Plains have taken the lead of them. The situation of the convicts in the growing colony had changed through the early 1800s, to the point where they were permitted to work in the community as a way of earning their own money for extra rations. Though it's not recorded when the theatre productions began at Emu Plains, the farm's administrator, Mr. James Kinghorn, allowed the Emu Plains convicts to work in the surrounding communities in their free time, and this included touring the plays being produced in the theatre. Initially, the Emu Plains troupe performed for audiences of other convicts and locals, but as their popularity grew, so did the numbers of the wealthier metropolitan patrons. The Emu Plains Company and the theatre is described in James Tucker's story, Ralph Rashley. There was no lack of timber. The materials for the walls of the edifice were thus easily procured, as were those for the very rude seats of the pits and boxes. The walls were filled in with mud, and the whole of the interior was whitewashed with pipe clay, of which there was abundance near, and it produced no despicable effect by candlelight. But the wardrobe, oh, the wardrobe! His glittering crown was composed of odds and ends of tin and copper, brightly furbished, most of it garnished with pieces of window glass set on party-coloured foils. A flowing wig fabricated of bits of sheepskin, the wool being powdered with bone ashes. A purple stiff cloak with cape and hood, and belonging to the wife of the camp constable, which splendid fur trimming had once covered a native cat. The company is recorded as having presented seasons of work between 1822 and 1830. The Emu Plains convicts presented mostly popular melodramatic works such as The Lying Valet, The Devil to Pay, and Bombastes Furioso. Though in its first years of existence, women convicts were also posted to Emu Plains, and may have participated in the company, no record of their participation exists. However, later records, after the more severe segregation policies were forced onto the settlement, show that the company had two talented and popular young male performers who would play the female parts in drag in the tradition of the Elizabethan companies, William Toogood and Charles Holden. Holden was particularly noted in the role of Lady Randolph in John Holmes's blank verse tragedy Douglas, a part that would go on to be played by Sarah Siddons in London. Emu Plains operated as a private theatre, as commercial enterprises were still forbidden to convicts. No tickets were sold and no money was taken at the box office. Instead, the company survived on a diet of gifts and donations by local appreciators of the arts, and at the time of its closure, it was regularly playing to houses of 200 plus. Regrettably, their success was also their downfall. The placement of advertising in the Sydney Monitor, encouraging audiences from the city to attend an upcoming performance, was the straw that broke the camel's back. Under pressure from all sides on the city theatre issue, the newly posted Governor Darling was quick to close the theatre at Emu Plains and have all the players broken up and sent to different postings. Despite the closure and breakup of the Emu Plains company, the pressure in the city for a purpose-built public theatre continued to intensify and would eventually culminate in the establishment of the Theatre Royal, the first commercial theatre, by the actor-manager Barnett Levy, who we will talk more about next episode. We don't hear a lot about these early Australian theatre makers, but their stories seem so very familiar to me. The struggle to make work, to find an audience, to keep a small, dedicated band of players alive. I see these stories of the first attempts at public entertainment in the European mode as evidence of the fundamental need of a community to tell its stories to itself. Regardless of class or rank or privilege, from the very first year of our occupation of this country, the need for live storytelling and sense-making has been strong. It's also been regularly a magnet for the antipathy and ire of the authorities and governments of the day. The attempts of the officials, bureaucrats and provincial Caesars to curtail and diminish the voice of the people, reserving culture only for themselves. So let us know what you think. Why are the stories of these early theatre makers not more familiar to us? What happens to our culture as a result of this process of active forgetting? Are there other stories of those early days you'd like to hear more of? Or are there stories that you know and you could share with us? I don't know everything and I'd like to know more, so leave your thoughts in the comments. Next month, the age of the actor-manager. Witness Performance is made possible by a grant from Creative Victoria, Monash University's Centre for Theatre and Performance, and the generous support of our subscribers. Witness Performance would like to remain free of advertising and an independent critical voice. Your support is vital to help us do that. Thank you so much to our supporters, and if you haven't already, go to witnessperformance.com and subscribe.